Well, it's really great to be with you folks here, and I was so inspired listening to the solutions that people were putting forward yesterday and today. And here's the thing, all of us know that these solutions require money. They require investment, and at the end of the day, they are going to require local investment. And that's why I've titled today's talk, The Local Investment Journey, The End of the Beginning. It used to just be the beginning of the beginning, but now we are at the end of the beginning, and I will explain why. Here's the good news. We know beyond any doubt that locally owned businesses are key to economic prosperity. We have a scad of studies that show that communities with a density of locally owned businesses have higher per capita job growth rates. That's the subject of this study here in the Harvard Business Review. We know that locally owned businesses contribute to higher income growth rate, and they contribute to environmental protection, and they contribute to local self-reliance and to resilience. We also know that locally owned businesses are highly competitive. This, from our neighbor in Canada, shows that the most profitable businesses in Canada have 10 to 20 employees, and they are about 60% more profitable than those firms traded on the Canadian Stock Exchange. We also know that local businesses constitute slightly more than half of the US economy by jobs and by output. Here in Blaine County, their presence is significantly greater. So given all of this great stuff about locally owned business, I want to conduct a survey that I've done on previous visits, but let's see if anything has changed. By show of hands here, how many people have mindfully bought something locally over the last week? See a lot of hands. Okay, next question. Those of you with pension funds, most of you have them. How many of you put at least 1% into locally owned business? Okay, so a couple of hands have gone up. We are the problem. Because here we are at a conference on resilience, on supporting local economies, and yet we, of all people, in Blaine County, of all people, are over-investing in the Fortune 500 companies we're suspicious of, and under-investing, not investing at all, in the locally owned businesses we know are essential to achieve the objective. So we've got to fix this. And the reason why we have this problem is an issue called securities law. Securities laws were passed in this country in the early 1930s and basically created two classes of citizens. If you're in the top 1% of income or wealth, you're an accredited investor, you're allowed to invest in anything, anytime, no questions asked. If you're in the other 98, 99%, you can only put a penny into a local business if it has done $25, $50, $100,000 of securities work. This is extraordinarily expensive for small businesses. So it's not surprising that we don't see a lot of options for small business. This was what led a bunch of us to push for a change in federal law. And I'm pleased to say that in April 2012, President Obama signed in what I think was the most significant shift in securities law in 80 years, which is the Jobs Act. Now, it took more than 3 years for the Jobs Act to be implemented by the Securities and Exchange Commission, but it finally happened in May, hence the end of the beginning. Every small business will now have an option for raising up to $1 million nationally at a relatively low cost, and every American will be able to invest at least $2,000 per company per year into those businesses. This is a radical transformation of securities laws. How do we get here? I think it's important to remember that this change in securities laws required us to be audacious. We didn't just say, we want a little change in the current securities law. No, we questioned the overall premise of securities law. We said, we understand that you're protecting Americans' grandma from buying swampland in Florida, but you allow grandma, like my mother, to gamble in every casino in the United States without ever asking her about her income. It's weird. You can lose everything in gambling whether or not you're an accredited gambler. So that kind of logic opened up people's thinking about rethinking how we legislate reduction of risk. The second thing that happened was we were bipartisan. The Jobs Act reforms brought together the locavore left and the Tea Party right into a great coalition. And in a sense, my own politics is a fusion of the two of them. Finally, we were determined because the Securities and Exchange Commission, after this law was passed, dragged their feet. And it was really worrying to us that they were going to destroy the law altogether. So we went out into the states and we convinced 31 states to reform their securities laws around investment within the state, intrastate investment. And this kept the fire underneath the SEC to finally get the job done this past May. The revolution is not complete. And I have this picture here because the revolution in local investment really involves not just the issuance of securities, that's what the Jobs Act was about, but also, once you have these securities, you may want to sell them at some point. So we need to create local stock exchanges. And then, we can't all do investment on our own, so we need local investment funds, like what Orrin created in the Fair Food Fund. And we also need pension funds to start thinking about how to invest in all of these elements. So here's what we don't entirely appreciate. Pension funds, a lot of the people who were here earlier, will never think that seriously about transferring many billions of dollars into local companies unless there are proven local investment funds that can take that kind of money. These local investment funds will never get very far unless there is a local stock exchange that gives the things in the fund some value. And the local stock exchanges will never be formed unless there's a critical mass of local securities. So we're really just at the very beginning here. But I want to suggest to you where things are heading next, because a lot is happening. I want to talk just very briefly about how people are pushing the edges of the Jobs Act, what can be done within existing law, and what can be done with very modest changes in the law. So first of all, the sort of finishing of the Jobs Act agenda. 31 states, as I said, have passed legislation, but guess what? Passing legislation doesn't implement the law. Implementing the law requires educating businesses and educating investors. And this woman here, Amy Pearl, is one of the world's best educators. I mean, she lives in Oregon. She worked with the Securities Department there to change their laws. And now she's in her car every other week going town to town to do this kind of grassroots education to get people involved. Another thing we might want to think about is the Jobs Act and these state acts were imperfect in one respect. I believe we need a lawyer-free zone, that there is some de minimis amount of investment activity, I believe it's perhaps around $100, that we should be able to do with no legal paperwork. Now this may sound preposterous, but this woman here took an article that I wrote and proposed this idea in and implemented it in the state of Maryland. We got both houses in Maryland to enact a $100,000 rule for local business there. Every local business in Maryland can now borrow $100,000 from its customers in $100 increments with no legal paperwork. And it was unanimously passed in both houses, signed into law by Governor O'Malley. The next thing we're going to need to start thinking about is the electronic spaces where these initial offerings take place. So the Federal Jobs Act allows people who are not broker-dealers to set up these portals, get licenses to set them up, and to collect finder's fees or success fees for the businesses once they have done their successful raise. So an example would be Milk Money in Vermont. The problem is that we have no idea whether the federal licenses will allow people who are doing state offerings to put the state offerings onto the federally licensed portals. And the state rules around the portals are much more restrictive. They don't allow non-broker dealers to operate most of the portals. So this is something we got to work out. Another thing that's going to be worked out is we're going to start raising the bar a little bit. You know, Jobs Act says $1 million, maybe we'll inch that up to $2 million. Maybe we'll allow people to put not just $2,000, but $3,000 in there. So let me talk about what's coming down the pike here. First, what's legally easy. If you're a city or a town, here are 3 things you could do this year that are entirely legal and would really push this revolution forward. First of all, put a list on your city's website of every business that's looking for local investment. You know, they have to, you're not actually doing the transaction, you're just providing information about who has done the appropriate legal paperwork to raise capital. The other thing you want to do is have a list of the local providers of something called a self-directed IRA or a solo 401k, because these will allow people to move their tax-deferred savings into local businesses in a legally kosher way. So just this very simple addition to the city website, costs a couple of $1,000s, begins to create a multi-million-dollar marketplace of supply and demand for local investment. Second thing a city can do is move its banking to a local bank or credit union. If you think it's impossible, go to the home of Barry Goldwater, Phoenix, Arizona, which is now in the midst of moving its banking to a local bank, knowing that as it does that, the money put on deposit there will do a lot more good in loans in Phoenix than it would in Malaysia. Number 3, municipal bonds. Municipal bonds are used for all kinds of really dumb things, dumb economic development projects, big attractions of outside companies. How about we start using municipal bonds to nurture the local investment revolution? Some of the bonds might go for some of the resilience infrastructure we've been talking about. Some of the bonds might actually finance food funds like Orange funds. If you're interested in where crowdfunding is heading, go to a site called Neighborly, because Neighborly is now working with cities to reorganize their bond offerings, their municipal bond offerings, cut them up in very specific tranches. So if I want to put money in the zoo rather than infrastructure, I have a legally open route for doing so. Number 2, investment tax credits. This is a 30-something telegenic premier of New Brunswick, a province in Canada, and last year he led the implementation of a tax credit for local investors. You now in New Brunswick get a 50% tax credit for every investment over $1,000 you put in a local business. I mean, that is huge. And this is something we could do in the United States overnight. We could do it at the state level. Once you have, forget about 50%, even a 5% tax credit, suddenly every investment advisor in Idaho is thinking, gee, how can I get my clients to take advantage of this? It's a game changer. What about what is legally challenging? What we would be breaking a little bad with? One is local stock markets. Now, last year, the state of Michigan passed a law saying we're going to create a local stock market, a place where people can resell their local shares of things on a secondary market. No one knows what to do with it. And one of the reasons they don't know what to do with it is that the SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission, has not permitted it yet. But it's pretty gutsy of Michigan to take the first step. And here's another step that a state might take. The province of Nova Scotia in Canada in 1998 passed something called the Community Economic Development Investment Fund Act. They basically made it possible for grassroots groups to create their own investment funds. And since then, 60 of these funds have been created, and you're allowed to move your pension fund savings into these local investment funds. And you get a tax credit if you do so. If the United States had as many of these local investment funds as Nova Scotia has per capita, we would have 21,000 of these funds. So this is another direction. But again, the SEC is skeptical. So, and I did want to mention that one of the funds created in Nova Scotia is run by this woman, Linda Best. She has a fund called FarmWorks, like Oren's fund, very much oriented to supporting local food businesses and local farmers. I believe that there's an enormous battle in federalism that is brewing, and it's a wonderful battle because it's basically saying to the SEC, how about we start allowing states to take experiments for what goes on in their boundaries. If a state wants to create a local stock market and local investment funds and local pension opportunities for securities that are just issued within the state, they should be able to do so. Or to think in Godfather terms, you know, what stays in our state ain't none of your goddamn business. I want to finally draw attention to one piece of work that I am doing with the Sun Valley Institute. We were very pleased to work with Post Carbon Institute and create a local investment handbook for the state of Vermont. It's free, you can download it. The idea is that we have basic descriptions of 28 local investment tools, and then we have case studies from Vermont in each of those tools. So now I'm doing another one of these handbooks for Washington State, and we would love to do one for Idaho. Anyone who's interested in working with us, let us know. The final thing I want to say, quoting my favorite old wise man, Francis Bacon, things that have never been done, never will be done, except by means that have never yet been tried. Thank you very much.